You're hovering over the remote, scrolling past hundreds of new options, and somehow you land, again, on The Office. You already know the jokes. You know when Jim looks at the camera. You know exactly which episode you'll half watch while folding laundry. And still, you press play. Your partner thinks this is unhinged behavior. The algorithm has stopped trying. And yet here you are, choosing something you've seen a dozen times over something brand new. Same with Friends, or rereading the Harry Potter like the ending might suddenly change. It won't. You know that. That's not the problem. The interesting part is why this feels so right. On the surface, it looks like laziness, nostalgia, or resistance to change. But that explanation never really fits, because this isn't about being stuck in the past. It's about what your brain is quietly asking for when everything else feels noisy, uncertain, or just too much. What looks like repetition from the outside is actually something far more intentional happening on the inside. The paradox, why knowing the ending is the point on paper, rewatching makes no sense. You already know that Michael Scott will say the wrong thing at the worst possible moment. You know Ross and Rachel end up together in Friends. You know Harry defeats Voldemort by the end of Harry Potter. The suspense is gone. The mystery is solved. So why does your brain still want this? Because suspense was never the main attraction. When we watch something new, uncertainty is doing most of the work. Who survives? Who betrays whom? Does this get good by episode 3 or episode 6? But when you rewatch Ferris Bueller's Day Off, the pleasure doesn't come from not knowing. It comes from knowing exactly when Ferris will break the fourth wall and enjoying it anyway. Predictability turns out to be the feature, not the flaw. Your brain isn't chasing novelty here. It's chasing assurance. It wants the emotional beats to land where it expects them to. It wants the comfort of inevitability. The ending being guaranteed doesn't ruin the experience. It stabilizes it. And that realization flips the whole judgment. Rewatching isn't about boredom. It's about preference. Familiarity breeds attachment, not boredom. Psychologists have a name for this preference for the familiar: the mere exposure effect. First described by social psychologist Robert Zayonk in the 1960s, it refers to a simple but powerful pattern. Repeated exposure to something tends to increase our liking for it. Not because it improves, but because it becomes known. That helps explain why a sitcom like Parks and Recreation can feel more emotionally reliable than most people you casually know, or why Seinfeld still feels comfortable decades after it aired. Familiar characters stop demanding your attention. You already understand their rhythms, their flaws, their logic. Your brain doesn't have to decode them. When you rewatch Back to the Future, you're not evaluating it. You're revisiting it. The experience becomes less about information and more about presence. Familiarity lowers resistance. It creates emotional ease. What looks like watching the same thing again is actually your brain choosing an environment it already trusts, one where nothing has to be proven, explained, or justified. Cognitive relief, when your brain finally gets a break. There's another reason rewatching feels so good, and it has less to do with emotion and more to do with effort. New shows demand work. Your brain tracks unfamiliar characters, motivations, timelines, and hidden signals. Every scene asks a quiet question. Is this important? Should I remember this? That constant evaluation adds up. Rewatching turns all of that off. When you put on The Office again, your brain already knows what matters and what doesn't. It doesn't need to predict outcomes or watch for twists. The mental load drops. Attention softens. You're not in detective mode anymore. You're on cruise control. This is especially appealing at the end of a long day, when decision-making is already depleted. Choosing a new show means risk. What if it's bad, disappointing, or emotionally exhausting. Rewatching removes that uncertainty entirely. The emotional terrain is familiar. You've already navigated it once and survived. In that sense, rewatching isn't passive. It's efficient. Your brain is conserving energy by choosing something emotionally predictable and cognitively inexpensive, something that asks very little and gives exactly what it promises. The story stayed the same. You didn't. Here's where rewatching stops being simple comfort and starts getting strange. You're not actually experiencing the same story twice. The plot hasn't changed, but you have. The first time you watched The Lion King, you probably saw it through Simba's eyes. Freedom, rebellion, escape. Years later, the same movie hits differently. Suddenly, Mufasa's warnings about responsibility and loss land harder than the stampede ever did. Nothing new was added to the film. The difference is perspective. The same thing happens with The Matrix. Early viewings feel like spectacle, slow-motion fights, impossible physics. Later, it plays more like a question about comfort versus truth, and why so many people willingly choose the familiar illusion. Rewatching creates space for reinterpretation. Without needing to track the story, your attention shifts inward. You notice themes you missed. You project your current fears, values, and regrets onto the same scenes. The story becomes a mirror instead of a mystery. That's why old shows can unlock new emotions. You didn't miss them before. You just weren't ready yet. Rewatching as memory, identity, and time travel. There's another layer to rewatching that has nothing to do with plots or psychology terms. It's social. Think about when you first watched your comfort show. Maybe it was Thursday nights on the couch with family, or sharing episodes of The Big Lebowski with friends until quoting it became a personality trait. Maybe Die Hard became a yearly ritual long before anyone argued about whether it was a Christmas movie. These stories don't just live on the screen. They're attached to moments, places, people. When you rewatch, you're not only revisiting characters, you're revisiting versions of yourself. Who you were when you first cared about these stories. Sometimes that's joyful. Sometimes it's bittersweet. A friend you no longer talk to, a parent who introduced you to Groundhog Day, a relationship that didn't survive, even if the movie did. Rewatching turns stories into time capsules. It lets you hold on to shared meaning long after the moment has passed. In that sense, pressing play isn't repetition, it's remembrance. Rewatching isn't escape, it's regulation. By the time you reach for a familiar movie, something else is usually true. You're tired, not just physically, mentally. The day has already demanded more decisions than you remember agreeing to make. New stories require commitment, attention, emotional risk. Rewatching doesn't. That's why people return to films like Good Will Hunting, fully aware that the "it's not your fault" scene is going to hurt. Or why Toy Story 3 still wrecks people who know exactly what's coming. The sadness is controlled. The timing is known. You're choosing when and how to feel something. Psychologists describe this as emotional regulation, using familiar experiences to steady your internal state. Predictable emotional beats create a sense of safety. The story resolves. The characters survive. The world makes sense again, even briefly. So when someone side-eyes you for watching, When Harry Met Sally for the 15th time, understand this: you're not avoiding growth. You're choosing stability. Your comfort show isn't a crutch. It's a companion, a reliable pattern in an unreliable world. And sometimes that's exactly what the brain needs.